Hello, everyone. We've reached Holy Thursday of our journey this Holy Week. And today we look at what Jesus did on the night he was betrayed. Our theme is radical hospitality, taking the lowest place. I'm going to reflect today on Jesus washing the feet of his disciples, mainly focusing on the gospel. But I want us to remember together the second reading from the Holy Thursday liturgy, which is St. Paul's letter to the Corinthians, which reflects what Jesus did at that Holy Thursday Passover meal. I received from the Lord what I handed on to you, namely that the Lord Jesus, on the night he was betrayed, took bread, and after he had given thanks, broke it and said, "This is my body, which is for you. Do this in remembrance of me." In the same way, after supper, he took the cup, saying, "This is the cup of the new covenant in my blood. Do this whenever you drink of it in remembrance of me. Every time, then, you eat this bread and drink this cup, you proclaim the death of the Lord until he comes." The word of the Lord. Our prayer tonight is one of my favorite prayers from the Sufi tradition. I think it captures very well, eloquently really, what Jesus taught his disciples about servant leadership on that night he was betrayed. So let us pray. O Divine One, to thee I raise my whole being, a vessel emptied of self. Accept, O gracious God, this my emptiness, and so fill me with your light, your love, your life, that these precious gifts may radiate through me and overflow the chalice of my heart with all those with whom I come in contact this day, revealing unto them the beauty of the joy and wholeness and serenity of your peace, which nothing can destroy. We ask this through Christ our Lord. My friends, this is the Passover of the Lord. It is tonight to gather the folks, although this year, because of shelter in place, we gather alone together. We count our blessings, and we pray for better days. We gather around the table, break some bread, and raise a glass of wine and toast those who have washed our feet in the past, and all those who are washing the feet of others today, all those who continue to serve us during this coronavirus crisis, those in medical services, of course, but also the grocery clerks and those who stack the shelves, those who deliver the food and deliver the mail, those who check on the elderly neighbors, those who collect our recycling and our trash. So many people doing so many things, washing the feet of those who are in need in this time of crisis. These are the foot washers who, in the manner of Jesus, on the night he was betrayed, rose from supper and took off his outer garments. He took a towel and tied it around his waist, and then he poured water into a basin and began to wash his disciples' feet and dry them with a towel around his waist. To stop the spread of the coronavirus, we've been washing our hands a lot lately. But on Holy Thursday, we wash feet. Instead of making our profession of faith, we practice it. It's remarkable. It's a remarkable ritual that reflects the true spirit of ministry. Think about it. Ministry is always messy, difficult to coordinate, clumsy, awkward, tentative at times, and yet hopefully always tender. A key truth in the story about washing the feet is that Peter resisted initially. "Master, you're going to wash my feet?" Jesus told him he might not comprehend it, what he was doing at the time, but you'll understand it later. But Peter's resistant to have his teacher wash his feet. This is the servant's role. Jesus is literally turning the tables at the Last Supper, no less forcefully than he had turned the tables of the money changers and merchants when he did that spring cleaning at the temple and turned over all those tables. But this table turning is more gentle. It's a soothing bath for the feet. Peter protests, "You'll never wash my feet." Ah, Peter, wonderful Peter, always putting his unwashed foot into his mouth. And Jesus tells him the truth. Unless I wash you, you'll have no inheritance with me. In a sense, Jesus has threatened to cut Peter out of his inheritance, out of the will of God. So Peter takes his unwashed foot out of his mouth and says, "Master, then not only wash my feet, but wash my head and my hands as well." Jesus turns the table and tells the truth. We have to come clean. Whoever is bathed, he said, has no need except to have his feet washed, for he's clean all over. So you are clean, but not all. Jesus knew his betrayer was at hand. He was at the table that night, and he would soon hand him over. It was time to come clean. Washing feet is an act of radical hospitality. It's an act of service and love. I recall a Methodist bishop saying to his congregation that often the word hospitality evokes the image of a soft or sweet kindness, like tea parties and cookies and coffee, bland conversation and a gentle atmosphere of coziness and politeness. He acknowledged that in our culture and in our church, the concept of radical hospitality has been lost, or at least has lost a lot of its power. For Jesus, hospitality meant welcoming everyone, friends and strangers, and welcoming each one as if they were holy. Perhaps one of the blessings that will come forth from this time of crisis is that we'll reclaim the true meaning of hospitality, because we're seeing it in foot washers today who are on the front lines ministering to those who are sick with COVID-19, that such radical hospitality is not without risks. Grocery clerks and bus drivers have died from the coronavirus because they continue to serve others. As that Methodist bishop said, long before we ever heard of COVID-19 or coronavirus, you see, the risk we face in welcoming all people, he said, is not that they will take away something from us, but rather that we will be called to give our lives away. Radical hospitality means letting go of our prejudices, letting go of our fears, letting go of our control. Have we ever felt so out of control as we have these last few weeks? If we practice radical hospitality, the kind that Jesus commands us to, the kind that he practiced that night at the Last Supper, we will be the ones changed. We'll be the ones transformed. And that's the real risk, but it's also the real reward. This is why the ritual we celebrate on Holy Thursday is more than a ritual. It's a living memory of what Jesus did on that night he was betrayed. Do you realize what I've done for you, he says? You call me teacher and master, and rightly so, because that's who I am. If I, therefore, your master and teacher, have washed your feet, then you ought to wash one another's feet. I've given you a model to follow, so that as I have done, so you must do. We do this in many and varied ways. We often associate hospitality with a spirit of welcome, of an open door. Mark Anipo tells the story about a friend of his who decided to paint the family room. And Robert awoke this one morning and made a list of all the things he needed to get the job done. And then he went to the hardware store and bought the paint and the drop cloths and the brushes and the wooden sticks to mix the paint. And then he returned home, and Robert mixed the paint outside, and then he waddled to the door with a gallon in each of his hands. The drop cloth was tossed over his shoulder. A wide brush was in his mouth. He didn't want to put anything down as he tried to open the door. He said, I was so stubborn that I had the door almost open when I lost my grip, stumbled backwards, and wound up on the ground, red gallons of paint all over me. Robert's not alone, is he? Even though our arms are full, whether we're carrying paint or packages from the store, groceries or gifts, luggage or laundry, wood for the fireplace, how many of us stubbornly believe we can still open that door? If I can just get that door open an inch, then I can put my elbow in there and then my foot, and then I can just swing the door open and get through it and not have to make a second trip. I try to keep the door open instead of making several trips. I don't put the stuff down. But we do this not only with what we carry in our arms, we also do it with what we carry inside our hearts. If we carry too much resentment, we can't open the doors. If we carry too much pain, it's difficult to open the doors. If we carry too much work, too much hurt, too much arrogance, it's difficult to open doors. We cannot hold on to things and enter, Mark Nepo writes. We must put down what we carry, open the door, and then take up only what we need to bring inside. Can I help you with that? A supermarket, a discount clerk asks when I have lots of bags to carry to the car. And my ego usually says, no, thanks, I can handle it. Like Peter, I resist having my feet washed or receiving a helping hand. Ego resists emptying. It's humbling to have one's feet washed. Can I help you with that? It's a simple question, and yet it sometimes takes on profound implications. New York has been one of the places where the coronavirus has hit the hardest. There have been many stories of the heroic witness of foot washers during this time of crisis. The people of that city and the people of New Orleans, another city that has been hit particularly hard by the virus, are cities that know how to come together in times of enormous suffering. The city of New York rose from the ashes after the terrorist attacks of September 11th. The people of New Orleans rose from the devastation caused by Hurricane Katrina. The kind of heroic spirit we're seeing today recalls for me a story I heard a few years ago, but I was reminded of it recently in a podcast. A 50-year-old construction worker, Navy veteran named Wesley Autry, had his hands full. Each hand was holding the hands of his two daughters as he was waiting on a subway platform in New York City. But he saw this young man on the subway platform having a seizure. And in the seizure, he falls onto the tracks. And the headlights of the oncoming train are visible in the tunnel. So Wesley had a split second to make a decision. He lets go of his daughter's hands, jumps onto the tracks, and lays on top of the young man, pushing him down between the tracks. The four cars rolled over them, the bottom of the cars touching the tip of Autry's cap before the train could stop. And Autry yelled out from beneath the cars to tell his daughters he was okay. Wesley Autry let go of his daughter's hands to save a stranger. He let go of his most precious gifts to save the life of a stranger he didn't know, who it turns out was a 20-year-old film student at the New York Film Academy who only had bumps and bruises from the fall onto the tracks. And when reporters asked him afterwards, why he did it, he said, I don't feel like I did something spectacular. I just saw someone who needed help. I did what was right. When we seek to live in right relationship with one another, washing the feet of others as an act of hospitality in the service of love is really about doing what is right. It's about living in that right relationship with one another. And it means we're willing to jump in the breaches for no other reason, because it's the right thing to do. This is the love we celebrate on Holy Thursday. We become the living memory of what Jesus did that night he was betrayed. Jesus invites us to pay attention to the needs of those around us by letting go of whatever it is that we're carrying, so that we're free to serve one another with radical hospitality. As Henry Nouwen wrote in his book, Reaching Out, hospitality means primarily the creation of a free space where the stranger can enter and become friend instead of enemy. Hospitality is not to change people, but to offer them space where change can take place. Washing the feet of his disciples on the night he was betrayed, on the very night he gave his disciples his very self in the form of bread and wine, affirms how the Eucharist is a radical action that nourishes and challenges us to live as loving servants. One of the stories that reminds me how the Eucharist was really given on the night Jesus was betrayed, which I think is one of the most profound aspects of this story of the first Eucharist. That story that comes to mind was from a writer who, as a young boy in 1944, stood with his mother and saw a parade of German prisoners of war being marched through the streets of Moscow. The Russian soldiers and police had cordoned off the crowd, mostly women that lined the streets. It was mostly women because the Germans had killed their husbands and their fathers and their sons and their brothers in the war. So this young boy listened as the women shook their angry fists at the enemy soldiers. He saw these women with their backs bent, stooped over from carrying the burdens of loss, straighten up to shout insults. These proud and arrogant German generals who were at the head of the parade. The police could barely contain these women. They were so angry, they wanted to run out into the streets and beat these generals. But then the young man watched as the crowd grew silent. The angry glares of these women turned to a stunned stare as the wounded soldiers trudged behind the generals. These men were thin and unshaven and exhausted. Dirty, blood-stained bandages covered their wounds. They hobbled on crutches and staggered with comrades, barely alive, clinging to their shoulders and their backs. The streets were silent, save for the thumping of the crutches along the cobblestone. Then an elderly woman in torn and broken boots pushed her way through the crowd, past the soldiers and police guarding the street. From the folds of her worn coat, she pulled out a crust of black bread wrapped in a handkerchief. She pushed it awkwardly into the pocket of one of the enemy soldiers. And then from every side, women ran to the soldiers, no longer shaking angry fists, but now in their hands they were holding bread or whatever they had in order to place it in the hands of these weary, wounded warriors. Now these men were no longer the enemy. Now they were fathers and husbands and brothers and sons. This courageous act of taking a piece of bread and giving it to the ones who were responsible for the death of their loved ones is what we celebrate on Holy Thursday. For this is the night when Jesus takes bread, breaks and blesses it, and says, "Take this, all of you. This is my body." To those who would betray him, deny him, and flee from him at his moment of need, he would say, "Here, this is my body." If Peter had difficulty understanding Jesus turning the tables of who would wash feet and who would have their feet washed, imagine his confusion when Jesus said, "This is my blood." Peter was well versed in the Passover ritual that we read about in the first reading in the book of Exodus on Holy Thursday. And Peter knew this wasn't part of the script. You see, when those women broke through the line and offered the wounded, hungry soldiers who were their enemies their bread, they did what Jesus did on that night he was betrayed. With that piece of bread, he said, "This is my body." It was an intimate gesture. Take and eat. This is my life that will now become a part of your life. And with that cup of wine, he said, this is my blood, the blood of the new and eternal covenant, which will bring about the forgiveness of sin. He washed the feet of his friends and enemies, and he said, as I have done, so you must do. On Holy Thursday, we celebrate the power of remembrance. Even in this time of social distancing, when we gather alone together, we remember the event that took place when a young rabbi gathered with his friends and closest followers to remember the Passover of his ancestors. In all three readings, the importance of memory is underscored. In the first reading from the book of Exodus, the instruction to remember is very clear. This day shall be a memorial feast for you, the book of Exodus says. And then Paul tells the Corinthians in the second reading, which we read at the beginning, about the memory he has received, which was handed on to you, that on the night he was betrayed, Jesus gave us Eucharist, with a ringing reminder repeated twice, just in case we missed it the first time. Do this in remembrance of me. And after Jesus washes the feet of the disciples, he tells them, I've given you a model to follow. As I have done, so you also must do. This is the night when we kindle that memory of the servant Jesus and how he creates communion out of chaos. This is the night for remembering and celebrating, but actions speak louder than words. Jesus seems to say on this night before he died, if you can't remember what I said, remember what I do. Remember what I do, this threefold action of Eucharist, breaking bread, passing the cup, washing feet, is to be carried out by everyone who claims the name of Christ. One year when I was presiding on Holy Thursday, I remember how cold the water was when we washed feet. Though the sacristans prepared the ritual with warm water, by the time we were ready to wash feet, the water was cold, probably because I preached too long. There was something, though appropriate, about having cold water for this ritual, because it reminded us that one of the reasons that we don't wash another's feet is because we get cold feet. In his book, Stories from the Shadows, Reflections of a Street Doctor, Dr. James O'Connell recalls walking into New England's oldest and largest shelter for the homeless with a sense of invincibility that accompanies one who's just completed 4 years of medical school and 3 years of residency. But he was told by the head nurse, a woman named Barbara McInnes, that at the nurse's clinic, each visit began with a foot soak. The waiting area had 10 chairs, all occupied by sheltered guests, soaking their feet in buckets of warm water that contained an antibacterial. This ritual, Dr. O'Connell said, was instituted by the nurses, not only for the comfort and hygiene of the guests, but also as a sign of respect and service. Barbara informed me, he said, that my apprenticeship would begin with a couple of months of learning the art and skill of soaking feet. He had just spent 7 years of studying to be a doctor at Harvard, and that included his residency, and now he was spending 2 months learning how to soak feet. She set his stethoscope and doctor bag aside. She said, no medical questions, no chief complaints, no review of systems, no diagnosing, just tend to the feet and ask what else you can do to help. For 2 months, Dr. O'Connell soaked the feet of guests who came to him, who came to the clinic. Following what Jesus did on that night he was betrayed, soaking the feet of the homeless shelter, Dr. O'Connell said, inverts the power structure and places the caregiver at the feet of each patient and far from the head. This gesture of respect for the literal and figurative personal space of each homeless person is critical, he said, and marked a contrast in how he was taught, to take charge during clinical encounters. He was humble enough to empty himself in order to be of service to the homeless guests. Because he said, after wandering the city for hours, suffering exposure in the extremes of weather, and then standing in a series of keys, waiting entrance into the shelter, a bed ticket, and the evening meal, he said a homeless person relished the chance to sit and rest while someone cleansed and soothed their feet. I want to conclude with a story that I tell often, but it never ceases to challenge me. Avis Crow is a contemplative who's worked for years in justice and peace ministry, and she had served as a hospice volunteer and with her husband started a ministry of hospitality. In an article in Fellowship magazine many years ago, she recalled a story from the Quaker tradition that occurred in New Jersey in the 1700s. There were these two families, two farmers and neighbors who belonged to the same Quaker meeting. Their farms joined one another, and it was kind of separated by a stream. Well, the stream rose up above both the pieces of property and then flowed down through the younger farmer's land before becoming the dividing line between the two farms. The younger farmer decided one day to divert the stream so that he could use the water to irrigate a portion of his land. This angered the older farmer, who visited the neighbor and objected to his actions because he needed the water He needed the water for his fields. Well, the younger farmer was unyielding, so they went to the Quaker meeting, which is the Quaker tradition, and the older farmer brought the issue before the friends' meeting, asking for their help to sort out the dispute. The meeting was unable to find a solution, so the matter was moved from the weekly meeting to the quarterly meeting, and then to the yearly meeting, because time after time they could not resolve this conflict. As the issue worked its way slowly through the channels of meetings, the relationship between the two families deteriorated to the point where they stopped speaking to one another. The wall of silence became an impenetrable boundary between the two farms. They basically excommunicated one another. Isn't that what we do when we don't speak to someone? We excommunicate. Oh, we don't talk to them anymore. Well, then one evening, an itinerant preacher stopped by the older man's farmhouse, asking for lodging for the night. And it was customary in those days. The family was pleased to offer hospitality and to welcome the stranger. And as they shared a meal, the farmer spoke of the conflict with his neighbor and his increasing frustration that they've been unable to reach any kind of just solution. Well, the visitor listened patiently. He was thoughtful. And when the farmer had finished the story, he asked the visitor for his advice. And the itinerant preacher thought for a moment, and then he said this simple statement: more is expected of some of us than others. That's all he said. More is expected of some of us than others. And then, with those words ringing in his heart, the older farmer retired for the night. The next morning, he gathered a basin, a towel, and a bar of soap, and he walked purposely down the path across the stream and knocked on the neighbor's door. The young farmer's wife was shocked to see the one who had become the enemy. When the farmer asked to see her husband, she replied that he was still in bed. Undeterred, the unannounced visitor declared he wished to go upstairs, so the wife led him up to the bedroom. The two men confronted one another, the one sleepily astonished at the surprise encounter. But without a word, the older farmer knelt down in front of the younger farmer. "Friend, I have come to wash thy feet," he said, and then he proceeded to do so. Without any further conversation, he washed the feet of the one who would betray him, who had betrayed him. Later that night, or that same day, the young farmer brought his family across the stream to visit the older farmer and his wife. The wall of silence had been breached, The relationship between the two families had been restored, and in a renewed spirit of cooperation, the two found a way to resolve their differences. More is asked of some of us than others. The one who was betrayed washes the feet of those who would deny him, betray him, and flee from him. He did it because more is expected of some of us than others. So, my friends, if more is asked of some of us than others, what is asked of you? What is asked of me? What is asked of us in this time of crisis? I pray as we gather around the tables on this Holy Thursday to drink some wine and break some bread, across the miles we will meet in prayer and recommit ourselves to be the kind of foot washers our world so desperately needs. A blessed Holy Thursday. Take good care. Be safe as we meet in prayer.